Okay, first off, my name is Kevin Kokomoor. My father, Carl, is here. He's actually a visiting Rotarian. So I actually grew up in a Rotarian community with the Lemon Bay Sunrise Rotary. And I actually was an Interact Club when I was in high school. And I actually got an Interact Club scholarship to go to college as well. So it's always a great pleasure to speak with Rotarians. And yeah, so I am relatively local. I went to school at the University of South Florida in Tampa, and I got a degree in history there and a master's in history there. And then I went to Florida State and I got a PhD in early American history there. And a lot of the work that I do is on the Southeast and the native people of the Southeast. And Florida history has always been something that I have loved because of my personal connection. And now I teach at Coastal Carolina University, which is in Myrtle Beach. So it's a little bit of a drive, but to here it's about 8 hours. To get down to Tampa, it's about 9, and to get down to Venice, it's about 11. So I still come home just about as much as I can to see my family. And so that's a little bit about me. And for you guys, I have a book that I've just recently published, and it is called La Florida, and it is on the early history of Florida. And so let me make sure this works. It starts moving in the right direction. All right. So it is about the connection of Spanish colonialism in the larger Southeast. It's not just a Florida story, because La Florida for about 200 years was more or less all of the Southeast. Spain could in no way actually govern any of this, but they claimed everything from Virginia to the Mississippi, Texas, Florida. And so really it is a connection between Spanish colonialism and the early Southeast in general. And so I split it up in these sections. I talk about the connections between Spanish colonialism and sort of the attempts to colonize Florida, what is happening elsewhere in the Caribbean. And then I talk about origins, stuff like the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church's role in attempting to colonize Florida. And then we talk about the way that transforms Florida. And in a lot of ways, that transformation is a nice way of saying it's a very destructive thing, but it is also a transformative thing. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the legacies, some of the interesting legacies that you can still see in the Southeast that have Spanish connections. And it really is a way to offer another origin story, another history of early America that isn't New England based. It isn't Protestant based. It isn't Plymouth based. It is alternative. When you think of early American history, you don't necessarily think of Florida. And so this is an attempt to get people thinking about all of the different cultures and all the different attempts that sort of make this American heritage. And so the easiest way for me to talk about all of this is to pick a place and try to show all of the different connections, origins, and legacies. And so for you guys, in North and in Central Florida is a really important place where I can use all of these examples and show you all of these connections and origins. And so what we have here is a map of some of the earliest attempts. Well, a lot of them unsuccessful, a lot of them going back to the early 16th century. And what you'll notice is they are on all coasts all the time. There are several attempts. Florida is seen, the peninsula is seen as incredibly important. And this gets to connections, because what I offer is there is a international trade route that begins in the Atlantic Ocean. And you'll see CC is highlighted. That stands for Caribbean Current. Then you have YC, that's the Yucatan Current. Then you have the MC, that's the Mexican Current. Then you have the LC, that's the Loop Current. Then you have the FC and the GS. The FC is the Florida Current and the Gulf Stream. Anyone that enters into this entire area, whether it's the Caribbean, whether they want to go to Veracruz on the west coast of Mexico, or Cartagena in Colombia, they have to take this current system. There's no other option. And that current system might move through the Caribbean, but where it always leaves is up past Florida. And this is a superimposition on the currents of the trader fleets. When you think of ships packed down with gold and silver and rum and tobacco, they have to take these currents. They might stop at Cartagena or Nombre de Dios or Veracruz, but they all have to take these currents through the Gulf of Mexico, meet back up in Havana, and then sail through the Florida Straits. And you get an interpretation from the last arrow that leaves there that you can shoot on out into the Atlantic and head back using the prevailing winds and current systems back to Europe. But really, you're beholden to this last current, the Florida current and the Gulf Stream, which really pushes you up the east coast of Florida. And I like to connect this to modern day traffic and say, what you see here is the original I-95 that goes up the east coast all the way up to, and this is traffic that really begins in Miami and ends in North Carolina. And for this reason, there are pirates, there are storms. If anyone remembers the storm from 2 days ago that moved through here, that would have caused a lot of problems in the Gulf of Mexico. People die on this trip all the time. There are shipwrecks all the time. And protecting this route from either storms or from pirates is the reason why St. Augustine exists. That's the reason why there are so many dots around Florida. There is a religious aspect. You're here to proselytize to the natives. You're here to claim this territory. But you'll see that there are outposts that are all along the coast of Florida because ships go down all along the coast of Florida all the time. That stretch is one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the whole world in the 16th and 17th century. And that's what gives us St. Augustine, because St. Augustine is right on this river, not river route, this ocean route, this Gulf Stream. And here's where we start to get a little more local spreading down into Central Florida, is that St. Augustine becomes this locus of the center of power. And what happens is it extends west into what is now Tallahassee, and it actually also extends down through the St. Johns River. And what we have is, when St. Augustine is established, it's there to protect the treasure fleets, but everyone else comes in and they want a piece of what is probably, hopefully, going to be the next colony. Among them are missionaries, Dominicans, Jesuits, Franciscans, and they establish missions. And there are quite a few Spanish missions in Florida. Now, the mission trail would go from St. Augustine to Tallahassee and Pensacola, and that's the really well-known one. But missions down the St. John's actually predate a lot of those missions. And in this area, and in this direct area that we are right now, there were no less than a half a dozen Spanish missions. And what you have is Aquero, Ellicali, Mayaca, Guerrero. These are the native peoples that lived here. And Spaniards would throw in a saint, and a Spanish mission was half saint name, half native population, right? So it would be Santa Lucia de Aquero, would be the Aquero on the natives. And, if you look very carefully at the red dots there at the center, the Guerrero province is actually south of here. The Mayaca province is just a tiny little bit east of here. So there are Spanish missions that exist here that extend from St. Augustine down through the St. John's, past Lake George, because there are large and significant native populations here. And so one of the connections here is the Catholic Church. They are entering through St. Augustine and they want to missionize to these native peoples. And that brings in sort of also ideas of legacies and transformations, because what happens here, these missions are how disease enters. And that devastates the native population, right? This isn't a triumphant story of missionization. We know that these missions want you to basically change everything that you know about your life and become good Catholics. So there's obviously a pressure there. We know that these missions are exploitive. They want you to do work. The repartimiento is a forced labor system. These missions impact this area that we're in. There are several rebellions. There's a Temuco rebellion in 1656. That impacts natives right around here. They rise up against the Spanish. And a lot of the communities are burned by the Spanish in retaliation. So we know that colonization enters from St. Augustine, and it is everywhere around us. Right? Because of St. Augustine, because of the attempt to make money, because of the attempt to convert souls, right? All of these missions and all of these systems move south. And that's where we get to some interesting legacies that you can still see today. What also do Spaniards bring with them? Well, they bring oranges. right? And I know this is an older history of Florida that is moving further and further south if it exists at all. And I know that citrus greening is just another nail in the coffin, but there was a time where the most citrus trees were on the St. Johns River. And we know that if you don't have to go very far back in Orlando's history, and the Citrus Tower in Claremont is an excellent example of that. The citrus groves that used to be all over here, they are all a legacy of the Spaniards who brought citrus here, right? We know that the Valencia orange that you know now was not the original orange. It was a Sevilla orange. It was a sour, bitter orange, which you would know as what you make mojo out of. But even when they would bring in these tropical Valencia sweet oranges, they would graft them to local Sevilla oranges that have been here for a really long time. The easiest way to reproduce orange trees is not by growing them from seed, it's to graft them. And they would graft to this rootstock because it's this hardy Florida rootstock. So they bring oranges. There's oranges all over the place. We have William Bartram moving down the coast of New Smyrna. That guy can't throw a rock without hitting orange trees. And there are hundreds of groves, thousands of trees. They're everywhere. And that's only about 200 years. They just spread. I mean, they take to Florida very, very, very easily. He says, nearly parallel to the seacoast and not about 2 miles across to the sea beach, all of this ridge was then one entire orange grove. And so we know that oranges are a legacy of this, which is still very evocative of Florida, even though we're losing out. Another example, an exploitative. This is a hacienda, a ranch. Spaniards bring cattle. This is where cattle originate, right? When everyone thinks cattle, they think of Texas. But at the same time, if not earlier, the same Spaniards that would go to Texas, New Spain to establish cattle ranches, there were also cattle ranches along the St. Johns River. And these cattle ranches, this is where you get from the Retenza and the Berenda. These are Spanish longhorns. This is where you get the Texas longhorn, but this is also where you get the Florida Creole cattle, right? The cracker cattle, the piney woods, the scrub. Those are livestock conservancy protected breeds because they have heritage. And even if you research sort of like 20th century cattle ranching, they would introduce Angus, but they would attempt to breed Angus with Criollo cattle because the Criollo cattle have this disease and heat tolerance. That again, what you're doing is you're basically grafting new cows to old cows, right? And you're using that established genetic base. I mean, these cows have learned to live in a really, really extreme environment. All of the cattle that create all of this pioneer heritage in the late 19th, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, the Polk and the Pasco counties, all these cracker cowmen, they are wrangling up free-range American cattle that are the direct descendants of cattle that were brought by Spaniards through St. Augustine, down the St. Johns. And it doesn't take much. I mean, I love driving up 75 because right around above Tampa, all the way up through Gainesville, I mean, you see all these sweeping, beautiful savannas. I mean, this place was meant for cows, right? They do really well here. Again, another straight line between the Spanish and basically Central Florida's culture, right? These are really powerful legacies that make Floridian identity. So I would say that, it's starting to get a little triumphant again. So we do say that these also become these huge targets of colonialism. About 100 years or so the Spanish are here in the 1560s. By the 1670s, South Carolina exists, and South Carolinians and Floridians hate each other. Every opportunity they get to go to war with each other, they do. The Carolinians will sweep down in the 1690s, and they will utterly destroy all of this. They will send Native American allies like Creeks and Yemasees, and they will raid these missions, and they will destroy every one of them. And again, the area that you're looking at here will be the frontier of that. We have a trader's map, and I'll zoom in. You might not be able to read it, but down here at the bottom, it basically says, and what you see is the San Juan River on the right-hand side, passing by St. Augustine. So this is a map from basically an English slave raider in 1719. He makes his bones raiding into Florida. He is stealing human beings and sending them back up to South Carolina. And what he says is, from the San Juan River, and the San Juan River basically ends right where this writing begins, and he says, here the Carolina Indians leave their canoes when they go to war against the Floridians. They move right through this area. And they do say canoes because everyone, it doesn't take long. I mean, this area is just one gigantic set of lakes. And canoe traffic would go from St. John's to Lake George, all the way through Okeechobee, all the way down to basically the Keys. So what you have is natives from another part of the Southeast moving through this area and absolutely just devastating it. And there was nothing left here. And that gets us into our last one. When I was saying Jerome and Myakka and Calusa, these are the original sort of eastern woodland natives that literally crossed the land bridge 12,000 years ago and populated this area. But those are the names that you recognize with the state of Florida. You recognize Seminoles. Seminoles mean runaways. Seminoles, and anthropologically speaking, we call this ethnogenesis, the creation of an identity. Seminoles come from somewhere else. Seminoles are the natives that did this raiding. They raid into Florida as Creek Indians. They come back in the 1750s, the 1760s, the 1770s. There are no more natives left in Florida, but you know what is left in this area? A ton of cows because of the ranches that they destroyed. And they come here and they see all of these cattle in the Alachua area, in the Gainesville area, down here, everywhere between Alachua and Lake Okeechobee is just absolutely chock filled with these cows, this cattle. And they come in here and they say, this is fantastic. We're not leaving. And Creeks move down into Florida and they become Seminoles. And they stay there. They just don't ever come back because this place is fantastic. There are no Europeans here. There's no other natives here. I have this really long quote. I won't try to beat you guys' head over it, but it basically says, and I'll read it for you. This is William Bartram again. And he says, behold yonder, coming up through the darkened groves. And by the way, groves, he means orange groves. They're really sneaking out through the orange groves. Sneakingly and unawares, the naked red warrior, evading the Elysian fields and green plains of Alachua, at the terrible appearance of the painted, fearless, uncontrolled, and free Seminoles. All of the animals scatter, is what he says. And I'll skip to the end and I'll say, the red warrior whose plumed head flashes lightning, whoops in vain, his proud, ambitious horse strains and pants. The earth glides from under his feet. He's a botanist. He loves these really pretty words and everything. He's like trying to paint you a picture. But what he's really saying is Seminoles are horse people. Seminoles are cow people. The Seminoles say, we are cow people. We owe our entire identity to cows and horses in here. And he basically says cows are just wandering around on this plain, and then here the Seminoles come dashing in. And we know that the first Seminole that we know of on the record that lives in this area, his name is Ahia, and everyone knows him as Cowkeeper. It's literally his name. And he exists just north of here in what is now Alachua, on the Alachua, we call it Payne's Prairie. This is the legacy of Spanish ethnogenesis, and they would freely admit this. If you go down to the Big Cypress, they still have cattle drives, right? They're trying to maintain their culture because they say, this is our culture. And so you have a Seminole history. All the Seminoles that exist in Florida many of them derive themselves from the Cowkeeper. His nephew, Payne, is where Payne's Prairie comes in. When he is killed, right, by Americans in the War of 1812, it devolves to Bowlegs. He is a nephew. He is in the kinship group. He basically moves a little bit further down to the Suwannee River. So now we're getting a little bit closer, but a little bit more to the Gulf Coast. When he is killed by Americans in Andrew Jackson's invasion in 1818, it develops to Micanopy from that town in north central Florida. He is of the same kinship group. He was killed, he's not, I don't think he's killed. I think he's forced to immigrate in the Second Seminole War. Then it devolves to his kin, and now you're moving down into the modern Seminole lineage evolves from Cowkeeper, who came to this area basically because of cows. And you still have all of these traditions, right? You still have the Great Florida Cattle Drive that would move more or less right through here, right, to evoke the sort of pioneer cattle heritage. And you also have the Big Cypress, right? This is a cattle heritage that basically everyone shares. And I think I'm going the wrong way. And so, I offer these as examples because what you have is the gateway that St. Augustine creates. It creates, it's not just about St. Augustine is the point, because even though South Florida was at one point most of the Southeast, it doesn't take very long until it really just is the panhandle of Florida, Pensacola and St. Augustine. But even though it shrinks, right, you have all of these legacies that have outlived. I mean, St. Augustine and the Spaniards, I mean, they lost in the Great War of colonization, right? The British and the Carolinas and Virginia, they won, right, of the forces of colonization. But in all of these ways, when you look at even just the existence of orange trees to cattle to these ranches to Seminole identity, the Seminoles are very proud of their identity as the hunters of cows, and that is what leads them in here are these connections and transformations. So again, the book moves to these really connections about the Gulf Stream, and it moves to sort of like the Catholic missionary traditions, and then it moves to sort of like the transformations, the destruction of one group of Native people, and then basically the regrowth of another. And then it leads to these legacies like barbecue, like the cattle tradition. All of these have these Spanish legacies that go really far back. And again, to summarize, to close it up, it's very easy when we come to a place like this, to Orlando and Central Florida, to see that, because it's very few places where you have all of these traditions sort of like coalesce and move through this one area. And so I had this. I published this only about 4 months ago. It came out through Pineapple Press, which does a lot about Florida history, which is through Roman and Littlefield. So I encourage, I brought some with me, and I'm selling them if you would like. And otherwise, I think I gave us some time left, so I can answer some questions if anyone has any.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. Questions? Go ahead. One, apologize to you once again, Kevin, for really introduction, not intentional. But not just blank on it.
Sitting with your dad, I got a better one. So it's reminiscent. So you go from Spanish colonization to British colonization. And I'm thinking like the Floridians must have felt like that for quite a long time they were in a convent, and then after the British in a brothel, perhaps. The cattle, isn't it that cattle is still something like our fourth statewide source of income, or possibly even higher?
I think it's like 2 million head or something like that in the state of Florida. It's still pretty significant. I know that the whole area around Arcadia and Polk County still has a very, very strong cattle tradition, and there's still a very strong cattle tradition south of the lake as well. And the Seminoles still have a huge. I think the Seminole own 250,000 head, because they use it as basically a cultural heritage icon, and they use it. But yes, I think we definitely over the past 100 years have lost out to Texas, Oklahoma. I think they're producing then the 20 to 50 million head. But as far as per capita and as far as the amount of ranches, there's still millions of head of cattle in Florida.
Questions. I'm from Jacksonville, Fort Carolina, in the French Fort, and Paris Island, second French fortification. If the French fleet that left the St. Johns River to attack the new colony of St. Augustine is not destroyed by a northeaster, do the French take St. Augustine and do they control Florida, rather than Spain? And then the second Seminole Indian was fought with the massacre of May after Williston. What if the indemnity South Oklahoma?
Yeah, two excellent. So I did cover stuff in the book. Is a really important part of the early chapters is this constant struggle between French Huguenots, Calvinists, and Lutherans, and then the Spanish. And the Spanish really get sort of an extremely violent rap after all this because they absolutely just massacre all of these French who are shipwrecked along the coast, and they could have just basically left them to rot there, but he single-handedly just by hand kills all these people. Pedro Menendez de Aviles does when he's. And so the question is, would the French have done the same thing? And I think that, Jean Ribault, who was going from, there's one army marching from St. Augustine to Jacksonville and one army going from Jacksonville to St. Augustine to destroy each other. And, Ribault absolutely clearly would have done the same to Pedro Menendez de Aviles that Aviles did if the shoe was on the other foot. Now, the question is, there are several attempts to settle Florida. And I could go back to that image of all of the attempts and that Pedro Menendez de Aviles is only the successful one. There's like 6 attempts before him to settle there because the Spanish are so intent on settling this. They throw money at it and money at it and money at it. And that is a very interesting sort of counter argument. Would the French have controlled this? I think that they could have, but the Spanish would have come back again and again and again to try to dislodge them. It would have created a lot more violence. Absolutely. Who would have won out in the end? I'm not sure, but the Spanish were deathly afraid of the French, and Pedro Menendez de Aviles was there to protect the place and destroy the French. And we know that if he had lost that, I can't imagine them not attempting it again, if that makes sense. And one interesting thing about Seminoles, it is hard even to call Seminoles because they are so unique. One group has a town structure, the other group has a town structure. They don't consider themselves really as one cultural entity, if that makes sense. So during the Second Seminole Indian War, the American Army would say, we signed a treaty with these guys. We signed a treaty with the Seminole. And there are Seminoles over here that say, you didn't sign a treaty with anybody. You signed a treaty with them, and they can go away. We're not going anywhere. So the autonomy of Seminoles, they are the most autonomous natives that basically have ever existed in North American history. And that is what allows them to exist today, is that just because one group over here on the Withlacoochee might have decided to leave, that's got nothing to do with us. But this is what eventually beats the American Army in the Second Seminole Indian War, is that these groups just keep moving further and further and further south into more and more inhospitable places. And the U.S. Army is losing the majority of their soldiers to disease and sickness because they're trying to march them through a swamp. And finally, the Army goes, if you want it, take it, right? And that's, it is that band that stays. And there's only maybe 1,000 of them, because everyone else is forced to leave, but it's because there is not one single Seminole identity. Even the identity of Seminole just means we're people who ran away, right? So there's not one single Seminole identity, and they use that to their advantage. They would say, we are the unconquered. We never signed a treaty. Well, plenty of Seminoles signed a treaty, but not those, right? Because they claim we're a different group. And if that answers your question, when I try in the U.S. Army saying, you're Seminoles, this guy signed a treaty, you all have to leave. What are you going to say? Right? Absolutely, to hell with that guy, right? I have nothing to do with him. And they're unbeatable like that, if that makes sense.
Just a quick question. You mentioned the Greeks coming south in the 17th, 18th century. The Templars,
this is the moment when they are destroyed. It is the Creeks that are coming down. The only reason so in the 17th, so we're talking 1690s and 1700s, the Timucua have already been devastated by disease. So where there was 20, 50, 60,000, there's 2, 5, 6,000. They're already 90% depopulated because of disease. And that is because Spaniards forced them into mission, and then the disease just wave after wave. We have very good accounting of the disease. There's influenza, there's yellow fever, there's malaria. It just wipes them out over and over and over again. So they're already about 10% of what they were. And then the Creek come down, and all of these natives are huddled into these mission groups, and the Spaniards won't let them have guns because they don't want them to be hunters. They want them to be farmers. So they are entirely defenseless. And the Creeks come down, and they just basically slave raid whoever is left. So to answer your question, there are several language groups in Florida that for the most part are extinct. And the Timucua language is almost one of them. The Spanish friars made a really good job of translating the Temuco language into Castilian Spanish so that they could missionize to them. And they wrote so much down in the Temuco language that we actually have been able to uncover the Temuco language using Spanish documents, which is just so ironic, right? They only wrote it down so that they can basically give you, so that they could do confession. And so we wrote enough of it down so that we can uncover that language. But that's a little bit of an exception. The Ocala, the Usita, the Makosa, the Calusa, the Tequesta, the Ais, they're more or less gone. There are remnants of them that would become the Seminole, but we know that their numbers are so small by the time that Spain leaves in 1763. The Spaniards basically say, whoever's left, physically left with us to go down to Havana and just leave. So there are examples where we have been able to uncover the language, but for the most part, the only accounts we have of their existence are from these colonial records, because they were, it's the term extinction is a really strong term, but they're gone, unfortunately.
Yeah, colonization these days is pretty much a four-letter word. We have to continue to, I have to apologize the fact that my great-grandfather was in the Civil War on the Confederate side. It seemed like everybody else in Europe is now going to apologize for the fact of being part of the colonization. We teach it to with a balance.
So I think the word balance is critical there. I am not, I am not here to poke holes in anyone's heritage and tell them that their grandparents were awful people. I think it is important, as someone who teaches about Native and teaches about the Southeast, I think it's important to tell both sides of the story. And I think, and I don't want to get in trouble by saying this, I think that when people call it revisionist, I think that what they're really admitting is that you're trying to tell the other side of the story. And that side of the story wasn't told 100 years ago. And so in telling that other half of the story, you are telling a part of the story that's not so pretty. And that is unfortunate. I still think it's very important. I do use the term transformation because it is devastating, but it is transformative at the same time, because it does lead to the creation of entirely new groups. But to answer your question, I think the answer is balance. It has to be balanced. And I would agree with you that the term colonization is really touchy right now. That's like a battleground. And, there's in academia, I'll give you an example, the settler colonialist. That's the term. That's real hot in academia right now. And colonization could be anything. Colonization is you're here for the gold. You're here for gold mines. You're here for tobacco. You're here to do this. You're here to do that. Well, in America, they had a really unique kind of colonization. It was settler colonialism. And what you didn't need the gold mines. What you wanted was the land. And because you're farmers, you come from a farming culture and you want the land. The problem with that is the Spaniards, and I'm not making Spaniards sound good here. They are the people, the encomiendas, they're parts of Mientos. You can't wipe out a native population, because if you wipe out the native population, who's going to do your work for you, mining gold? Puritans don't have that problem. You don't need natives. You need their land. And you need them to be gone. That's what you need. And that opens you up to a whole nother level of treating people poorly. And, that's something to consider. That's about as hardcore as it goes right there, because what you're talking about is now you're throwing around terms like ethnic cleansing and genocidal intent. And it is complicated. I will say that, that there are definitely, it's very complicated. It involves a lot of conflict, and but the whole story is the whole story.
Thank you for passing the information. I'm curious, what influenced or inspired you to start your journey with history?
Well, I've always loved history. That's just I did AP in high school, and I think I scored a 5 on the AP history exam. And when I went to college, they were going to give me 2 semesters of history credit, and I didn't even take it. I just retook the history courses because I liked it. And then Actually, this is kind of a USF thing, so I'm sorry for all the UCF people here, but when I went to USF, I worked for the Tampa Bay Lightning for like 7 years. And Kokomoor Park, which is where Fort Brooke was right there. And I would eat lunch literally in the dead middle of the night because I was working overnights, and I would go to Kokomoor Park and literally teach myself about seminal removal. And that's what got me down that road. But I just, I've always found it really fascinating, and I didn't really know what I was doing with my life, and I had somebody tell me to go to grad school, and by the first semester of grad school, I just knew I wanted to be a teacher. I knew I liked looking at the documents. I knew I liked doing the research and the writing. And then from there on out, it's pretty easy, but I've always had a passion for it.
So appreciate your whole program. It was wonderful, but I had a couple of things I'd like to ask. One, I just read a Pineapple Press book, The Forgotten Florida. It talks about a gentleman that the Spanish still owned it, bought a big land grant from one of the Spaniards, and when it turned hands, they didn't get to keep it, but I guess it was from Fort Brooke, basically south of Key West or something like that. But if you could speak some on that, if you know anything. And then the second thing was, I just went to Beaufort, South Carolina, and there was a fort there, and I'm not sure if it was the French got it first, but it was the Spanish wanted it as an overland route to bypass the Caribbean, to avoid all the pirates. I don't know, were they ever successful in making that an overland pass to the gold?
So, that's actually really, so to answer your first question, I am familiar with lots of grants. I'm not familiar with one south of Fort Brooke. There are several that the Spanish give in the last days. And American authorities have to go to Cuba and have to go to Madrid to hunt down all of these land dealings and deeds, which is actually a really incredible story. The big one I know of is around Alachua, where Arredondo got like this massive grant. And so I know that that's not unordinary. I know that massive grants were given like that. To answer your other question, you see the black dots that go into North Carolina? That is an attempt to get to Mexico. And if anyone wants to, I don't have an image to zoom out, but if anyone wants to do the math in their head, that's a long walk. And no one had any idea that what was in the interior of the United States of America. Pedro Menendez de Avelas said us, and to answer your question about Beaufort, I believe it would have been Santa Elena, which was the Spanish version. Before that, it would have been Charles Fort, which was French. They loved the idea of being in this area because it solves the exact question that you're asking, is that so many people die along that stretch, the Florida current, that they love the idea of settling a land route around it. And the black dots that go up into North Carolina, that's Juan Pardo, who is a Spaniard, who is basically an officer under Pedro Menendez de Avelas. And Pedro Menendez de Avelas goes to him and says, I want you to chart a road to Zacatecas, Mexico. And he gets to Tennessee before he's like, I don't know where I'm going, but I'm pretty sure I'm not in Mexico. And he was nowhere close. So he had to turn around, right? There's no way that you can make that road. The road that they do try to make is a road from either St. Augustine or from Santa Elena, South Carolina, directly to Pensacola. And by doing that, you only have to do some of the loop, if that makes sense. You enter in the Gulf, because down on the bottom would be Veracruz. That's where the road from Mexico is coming. And San Juan de Ulúa is this massive stone fort in Veracruz Harbor. And they would literally collect all the gold from the mines of central Mexico, store it there until the fleet comes. The fleet would load these boats up, and then they would only have to get to Pensacola. And then they could really walk it from Pensacola to Santa Elena in South Carolina, and therefore get around the worst stretch. The problem is, we see the blue, it's Tristan de Luna and Ariano. He tries to settle Pensacola in 1559. And does anybody want to take a wild guess at what stops him? A massive hurricane. Because he lands in September, which is the worst time to be anywhere in the Southeast for hurricanes. It's like the dead center of hurricane season. He lands there, his ships, he hadn't even landed all the supplies, and like a Cat 5 comes in and just wipes out everything. And blows through the ships. We found the ships. And basically ends that attempt at colonization. And it's like ironic, because it like makes the whole point of why you're there, right? To stop that exact thing from happening. But yes, the answer to your question is, they try all the time to get around Florida. And Pedro Menendez de Avelas actually tries. He literally goes down the St. Johns River all the way to Lake George, and then he goes all the way to the Colusa River, all the way to Okeechobee, desperate to find a water route. And I like to explain this is like the first attempt at the cross-Florida barge canal. right? Because this is huge politics in the 1880s and 20th century. 200 years later, we're trying to do the same thing, and that's get around the Florida Straits. But to answer your question is, if it's not about Catholics and Protestants, then it's about getting treasure from point A to point B, and they try several times to build that road and connect those dots.
Sure, last question.
Sure.
Can you give us the briefest synopsis of how the deal for the Seminole tribe to exclusively own casinos in Florida went down?
Absolutely, that's easy. The Fort Brooke parking garage, is on Fort Brooke, was Fort Brooke, which existed all the way to the Civil War. And when they were digging some of those municipal buildings out, they found the cemetery, and the cemetery contained the interred remains of Seminoles, soldiers, and Seminoles. Most of the Seminoles that were interred there weren't shot. They died of disease or they died of exposure while they were being forced west. And the federal government has to approach the Seminole tribe of Florida and say, what are we going to do? You know, they want to repatriate. And so they say, we're going to give you a small little piece of land that we're going to turn into a Seminole reservation. And the Seminoles can inter their ancestors on that reservation land. And guess what they also do with that reservation land in downtown Tampa? They build a casino on it. That's based off of the general idea that goes all the way back to American statecraft with natives, is that according to the time, natives were so powerful that the federal government treated natives like sovereign nations, which is why they created treaties with them. And when you create treaties with a sovereign nation, you accept their sovereignty. And so in the 1950s, Seminoles decided to basically go back to this treaty, these treaties that were supposed to be in perpetuity for forever, and basically say, we're in Florida on Hollywood Reservation. We're going to sell cigarettes without paying state taxes. And the state government of Florida said, the hell you are, we're going to sue you. And the Seminoles said, right here, West Rivers, Georgia, 1830, we exist outside of state jurisdiction. And the Supreme Court agrees. So you can't like murder somebody and run on to the Seminole Reservation and claim sovereign immunity. They have rejected that claim. But they have said that we have accepted that Seminoles exist somewhat outside of the jurisdiction of the state of Florida, which at least means that they don't have to pay taxes the same way that you have to pay taxes. And so the Seminoles developed that legal principle, and then they expanded to slots, and then they expanded to gaming, and then they buy the Hard Rock name. And that's actually creating a little bit of a problem within the Seminole Nation, because all of the gaming revenue is held in trust until you turn 18. And you live on the Big Cypress Reservation, and when you turn 18, you inherit millions of dollars in a trust fund, and then you immediately do what? You leave, right? And you go to Miami and buy a mansion because they're just kids. And that actually is becoming a little bit of a problem for the Seminole Nation of Florida, the Seminole tribe of Florida, because they're basically, it's a brain drain. It's a culture drain. So they do stuff like this. They give talks like this and say, we're going to reinstitute cattle drives. We're going to reinstitute native schools that teach you how to speak Yuchi and Hichiti and Muskogee, so that we really can keep our culture, right? Because it's become so successful, it's actually become a threat to cultural continuity. But does that answer your question? Great political and economic strategy. Thank you, Kevin. Good. Thank you very much. I think that we had a little bit for your time today. Thank you very much. Remember your staying.